Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Kim Elena Ionescu, and I am the Director of Sustainability at the Specialty Coffee Association of America, here today to do a webinar on gender and gender equity and gender equality. This is the fourth, I think, in a series of these webinars that we've done here at the SCA on different sustainability topics and challenges that are relevant to our community. So just a couple of notes about the format of this next hour. It will last about an hour, and we want to hear questions from anyone who is watching this broadcast right now. So please, if you have questions, tweet them at us. So on Twitter, tweet to @specialtycoffee and use the hashtag #MakeCoffeeBetter, all one word, if you would. That will allow us to answer your questions here on air. We want this to be a resource to everyone who is interested, and there is no question that is too elementary here. This is a topic that I'm interested in, but I feel like I am the first to admit that there's a lot that I have to learn. So I hope that you will also, feel comfortable with the expression of your questions and learning along with us. So with that, I would like to introduce our guests today who are here to talk about the work that they've done and the experiences that they've had, and just to lend a little bit of context to what the work that we have ahead of us in specialty coffee, and also to some of the challenges that we face and the opportunities that go along with those. So the first person that I will introduce is Christina Manfrey from Cultural Practice. Christina?
Sure, thanks, Kim. I'm Christina Manfrey. I'm a senior associate here at Cultural Practice. We're based just outside of Washington, D.C. A lot of work on helping organizations integrate and address attention to gender issues in a number of different sectors, including agriculture. And for the last 10 years, I've been working quite a bit on addressing issues with any number of different kinds of organizations within a variety of agricultural value chains. And I'm really happy to be a part of this webinar and to answer your questions today.
Thanks, Christina. And also with us is Kimberly Eason from CQI's Partnership for Gender Equity. Kimberly?
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here. I am also excited to be here in this conversation. I have been in the coffee business for about 20 years, and the work that I'm most excited about and the most passionate about is this work on gender equity. We started this initiative, the Partnership for Gender Equity, with the Coffee Quality Institute in 2014, and it's really exciting to see how the conversation is getting some momentum. So thanks for hosting this webinar, Kim.
Great. Yeah, thank you both again for being here. And what you just said, Kimberly, about gaining momentum is something that I want to use as a jumping off point for this conversation, because, in some ways I feel like there's a question that occasionally pops up when we start to talk about gender and approaching gender or addressing gender inequality in coffee, which is why this issue? Because gender inequality, while we recognize that, or most people maybe recognize that this exists, it's also something that feels like it's been around forever. Is there something? Why do we address this now? What's the sort of rationale? Is there something happening now? Is there some new way that we can get involved? So, I want to talk a little bit from my perspective about why we are here. And, I do think that while this problem is as old as, agriculture is, at least in our culture, it's one that where there has been an increasing body of work, or an increasing amount of research contributing to a body of work that shows that there are significant benefits to investing in gender equality in agriculture and at other stages in the coffee supply chain also. Within the past couple of years, I feel like this conversation around gender equality has gained some momentum, and that there have been a few different manifestations of that, including the Partnership for Gender Equity that CQI is doing, and some work by other organizations also, NGOs, nonprofits, but also businesses, coffee businesses, embracing this the challenge, and then also the associated opportunities for their business and what it means. So it feels like there's some momentum that's not just coming from the sustainability community or the development community to address this. And I think that's important, because that is the way that progress is made, is this kind of shared commitment by actors throughout the coffee value chain, or by businesses and organizations of different sizes and different types coming together and recognizing that this is something that does pose risks, and that also is worth tackling and tackling together. So taking these sort of individual and decentralized approaches and making them more centrally housed, and thinking about how gender can be approached through coffee, and what maybe some of the what are the tools that we could use in order to do that. My background is, before joining the SCAA, I was a coffee buyer for many years, and I am a female coffee professional and was a female coffee buyer, which was an unusual thing. I was often told by both other coffee buyers and people within my community here in the United States, but also by the producers and producer organizations I was visiting, how unusual it was for me to be a female coffee buyer, and I was very proud, of that, and like of the good work that I was doing. But after a decade of doing that work, it wasn't until about a year ago that I realized that when I talked about farmers, and I went back and I read many trip reports that I'd written from many different farm visits over that decade, many different countries, it was typical for me to talk about the farmer and his family. And I mean, at the time, I thought that that was really progressive, because I was including the family in that and not just talking about the farmer and the farmers, because typically, the people that I was meeting with, it was mostly men at the producer organization and also at the farm level. We would go visit a farm, and mostly it was a man who would greet us. And so that's how I thought about it, was the farmer, but that the farmer's family was also important. And I had this epiphany, as I said, about a year ago, where I realized that unless the farmer's wife or the female head of household, assuming there was one, was employed in some capacity off the farm, like in the local school or something like that as a teacher, then she's a farmer too. She is doing just as much work to make that household function, to make that farm a viable business for their family as the man is. The activities may be different. She may be drying coffee on the patio at home as opposed to harvesting coffee in the field, or she might be, cooking meals and delivering those to the workers as opposed to, getting up on into the coffee tree or into the shade trees and pruning them. But all of that work is really critical to making a coffee farm at any scale function. So once I realized that, it became clear to me, there was one of various examples for me, of how deep some of these habits are, just what it is that we have to address, even in ourselves, in order to see ways in which we might be just a bit blind, or maybe just predisposed to see things in a certain way that we hadn't recognized. So I am, as I said, really excited to be here with you two to answer a few of the questions that I have, and that I also have heard arise in conversations with other people in this coffee community of ours over the course of the past couple of years, as more and more conversations about gender equity and gender equality have begun to transpire. So yeah, with that, I'd like to start asking you two some of the questions that I have. And again, to anyone who's watching this, I'd love to hear your questions also, so tweet them at us. Kimberly, I'll ask the first question to you, which is, has something, like when I talk about feeling like there's more happening now, is that true? Has something changed? Is there like a reason that we're having these conversations more now, or is it just like recognition of what we didn't know, and that's kind of building on itself?
Yeah, I think it builds on this evolution and your own personal experience that you shared. But over a number of years, both in coffee and in the development sector, there's been an evolution in terms of awareness of the importance of gender equity. I like to look at the coffee sector, and even it really tracks with my own experience as peeling back layers of an onion in terms of the transparency and the understanding that we have about how the supply chain works. You can think back decades ago when there was very scarce amount of information and little understanding of where coffee came from, and even the fact that it was an agricultural product. And the main kind of conduits for any information about coffee farming were traders in the north or government representatives in the south. And then that evolved into us understanding more about, okay, well then we started to make connections with traders in the south who spoke English, or estate owners that would invite people to come and visit their farms and really see, okay, great, this is how coffee is farmed. It comes from different countries. It tastes different ways. But it really wasn't until the early 2000s that I think that we finally began to see the face of a small family farmer. And Kim, as you pointed to, traditionally that the concept of that family farmer has been a man. Yet we know so much about the role of women in coffee, and now what we've started to get more clear about is, okay, wow, inside that household there are women, there are children that make up a really important piece of the viability of the household and the farm as a whole. And then on the development sector, maybe they've been a little bit further ahead of us in coffee, but the UN establishing the Commission on the Status of Women, and some of the early meetings, and maybe the most notable meeting was the meeting in Beijing in 1975, the Conference on Women. And more there's been a spotlight from the development sector. And for those of us that kind of work in development, we know that if we don't look at gender as a strategic piece of any kind of development work that we're doing on the ground, our proposals, our work is really sidelined. So CQI, we realized we had to take it seriously, not only because it was important for gaining access to resources, but also because it's just the right thing to do. And I think kind of the crowning piece of bringing this together was the SCAA. We've had a connection with the Millennium Development Goals over quite some number of years, and of course gender and women's empowerment was a piece of that. But gender equity and women's empowerment now is clearly enshrined in the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And so there's a lot of energy globally focused on the importance of women within development overall, specifically in agriculture. And I think we're at really a great moment where we have kind of the convergence of all the great work in sustainability that's been happening in coffee, and the highlights, the spotlight from the development community on the importance of gender, and that we're really just seeing these now come together, and the imperative for us to do something, to take action, to be informed and engaged.
Great. That was a good answer. And you brought up something, though, another thing that I have questions about. Still, despite the fact that I was an English major, so I feel like I'm good with words in general. Christina, can you help me understand the difference between gender equity and gender equality and women's empowerment?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to do that. And I will try and do it in a way that gets me out of sort of my technical gender head, and hopefully it'll be clearer to everyone. I'll try and make it, as less jargony as possible. So a lot of what you'll hear a lot right now, because of a lot of the large donors taking much greater attention or spending a lot of more attention to these issues, and women's empowerment. And then every so often you hear this additional word of equity. So I'll go through all three of those. So if we start with gender equality, this refers to the ability of men and women, or girls and boys, to have equal opportunities and life chances. So it's the goal that we're trying to achieve. It doesn't mean that what we're doing is distributing the benefits or resources equally between men and women. That's just simply an equal distribution of resources. But it means that what we're trying to do is achieve or create the conditions whereby men and women and girls and boys can live to their fullest potential. Equity, on the other hand, refers to a process or of fairness in representation or participation and benefits. So you can think of equality as an umbrella term and the goal, but how we're going to get there is a process of equity, where we're trying to figure out how men and women or girls and boys can have a fair chance of having their needs met, and that then each one of them is able to have that opportunity, right? So finding the equitable mechanisms or the processes that create the conditions, whether it's, quotas falls into here. So, you're trying to, a quota system, take, for example, in political systems where they want, women to make up 30% of Congress or parliamentarians. That's recognizing that there are structural issues that keep women from being able to assume those positions, and the quota system or the 30% mark is an equitable mechanism to try and eventually get to a place where the conditions in which the conditions are created so that ultimately men and women can have equal opportunity. Empowerment, on the other hand, is a concept that is rather hotly debated, and you will find lots of different definitions or variations on what it means. It refers to the processes by which women or men, either individually or collectively, gain the ability to make and enact strategic life choices, right? So it's where equality is the goal, and it's having the ability to, or creating a condition of equal opportunity. The empowerment is really that I am able, or we are able collectively, to make our choices, to have power over our life. And you hear the word you hear the word power in empowerment, and it is about finding both power within individuals to make those choices and looking at the collective power between men and women. When you use the word empowerment, often you'll hear it coupled with other things. Women's empowerment, which refers to specifically finding the ways that women can either the power within or work with others to change the structure or change the system. You may hear also women's economic empowerment, which is a way of focusing our attention on a subset of issues around women's ability to make economic choices over their lives.
Thank you. That was helpful. I mean, in some ways, I feel like now I know more, but it may now I know how much more complex it is. But there are some things in there that I definitely think are, again, in the context of continuing the learning process, good for me to remember when it comes to things like empowerment not just being about helping and making women feel more empowered, or like as sort of an internal thing, but also something that is both internal and external, or that is both individual and kind of in a collective dynamic of where power resides, how people access power, how people and groups feel and use power. So that is definitely good, and the equality being the goal is another good thing to have as the kind of guiding principle. So Kimberly, I want to address another question to you, which is knowing that you have a background in coffee and have spent many years in the coffee industry, and are also, passionate about and now seeing coffee more and more through this lens of gender equity and gender equality. Do you think, are there things about coffee that are unique, like either in a good way or in a not so good way? Do we have opportunities in coffee that come from the way that coffee is bought or grown or sold? And do we have unique obligations when it comes to gender equality? Unmute, Kimberly.
There. There are certainly a lot of similarities across different agricultural products, right? Gender is an issue. It's a human issue that permeates whole societies. And what we know about coffee is that in most parts of the world, coffee is perceived to be a man's crop. And this is one of the distinctions from other agricultural products where women will produce local to sell at local markets. So your fruits and vegetables, small animals. So that's a distinguishing feature where women do a lot of work behind the scenes in coffee, but yet it's the men who end up showing up and taking the coffee to market and then therefore receiving that income. The amount of work that women do in the value chain varies, of course, from country to country and community to community and household to household. And for a variety of reasons, the tendency is for men to be the ones that have the access to the resources, that they show up at the trainings, they take up leadership roles in farmer organizations, and this leaves women without a voice, without even really any recognition that their work is important or even that their work exists sometimes. And so, I think because who we are with coffee, and I think specialty coffee in particular, and the make coffee better and all the things that we aspire to as the specialty coffee community, we have not only enough opportunity, but I think also that there's that we should be compelled to do something. And we have that opportunity to take action collaboratively so that we can really have a transformative impact on the coffee sector, and knowing that that gender is an issue that permeates societies broadly, we can actually then have kind of an effect, a ripple effect into other value chains and overall in communities outside of coffee. So I think we have an exciting opportunity, and maybe it's not an obligation that many of us see apparently, but I think something that we could certainly be compelled to do.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that there are, or embracing the fact that coffee is, a luxury product, and that it's not necessary for human survival, much as we love it and crave it, but that people really do feel passionately about it and care about coffee, and feel sort of a personal relationship with coffee in the way that they don't with, broccoli or tomatoes or something like that. It does give us this opportunity / obligation. But I say obligation, and I mean that kind of in a good way, that we have, or maybe responsibility is a better word, to use it to do things that maybe would be harder to do with broccoli or tomatoes. So, and Christine, I had a question that I wanted to pose to you, which is getting back a little bit to these ideas of gender equity and gender equality outside of coffee. I wonder sometimes, like I think about climate change and how not just climate change deniers, but people who are wary of the short-term economic effects of climate change would say, or climate change, policy would say, well, if you put in a carbon tax, it's going to stress business, and small businesses won't be able to compete, and we'll lose jobs, and the economy will slow down. So a carbon tax is not really a realistic thing to do. And regardless of how I might feel about that sort of argument, I wonder, are similar arguments ever made, or analogous arguments made with gender equality, that there's a downside to investing in gender equality in a supply chain or in a sector?
Yeah, we're not immune to that either. My view is obviously not. There's never to this, but When you look at the research around the links between gender equality and economic growth, there are studies that show, and I appreciate in your question that you made a distinction to say short-term effects, that, there are some studies that show that in the short term, some semi-industrialized countries, that in those countries, gender inequality can prove to be can provide rather a stimulus for economic growth. So if you think, for example, about export industries like the garment sector or even some ag products as well, that keeping women in low wage, higher profits can boost expansion of a particular export industry. However, in the long run, the strategies don't tend to play out so well. And there's another body of research that shows that there's a correlation between gender equality and economic growth. That's both across country and cross-country comparisons, and over time this correlation exists. In 61 countries, a positive correlation has been found between growth and women's participation in the labor force. And this is largely because gender inequalities can exact a high cost on economic and human development. So if we can think about gender inequalities or discriminatory practices and norms against certain population groups, what ends up happening is we, people and organizations, what they can do is they influence who gets educated, right? So gender inequalities reflect how people and organizations, who gets to go to school, who gets to go to college, who has access to land. Some of these become embodied in the legal framework for the country. Some of them are just very strong beliefs and norms that can influence, even despite a rather equitable legal framework, how people manage their day-to-day lives, or how communities decide ultimately who gets land or who gets access to credit, what communities or organizations, right? The inequalities also reflect how responsibilities are divided in the household, which can impact who has time to learn about new ag technologies or techniques, attend training, or meet buyers. But what's important, I think, here is that for a sector or an industry, you want to be able to harness the talents of your labor force. And because by harnessing the talents of your labor force, you can increase productivity and competitiveness. And that's really difficult to benefit from the talents of your labor force if you're guided by perceptions or stereotypes or ideas that men and women are only suited for certain jobs, or that their biology makes them incapable of doing certain tasks, or because you hold ideas that women are not capable of taking on leadership positions. So if I think back to what you were saying before about your use of sort of the farmer and his family and just the language, I mean, I think the language, I was a language major, so this is really important to me, but I think the words that you choose to express how you think about the communities that you work with or the organizations, and one thing is farmer and his family, that reflects certain biases that we aren't always aware of. And that what we want to be doing is taking a moment to, you also talked about sort of the personal reflection and even in ourselves, and I think that that's really important, that we take a moment to think about what are the biases that we have and how those get manifested in a number of ways in our organizations, and in ways that we're not necessarily, that we weren't intending to have negative consequences. Ultimately, I mean, I think when you're looking at these questions about the benefits of gender equality to a sector or the productivity or competitiveness, I mean, when you fail to take advantage of the talents of what could be 50% of your workforce, and women are just as capable and educated these days as men, it's not hard to see that you may be missing really, really important opportunities for innovation by allowing certain discriminatory ideas or perceptions or stereotypes to interfere with your production and growth strategies.
I'm glad you brought it back to that little anecdote I told earlier, because I was definitely thinking about that as you were talking. Not that, the structural inequality in a particular community or cooperative was my fault for saying the farmer and his family, but that without even realizing it, that I was sort of perpetuating this idea, or I had kind of bought into that, to some of the existing norms without questioning them, or without bringing any kind of, or just sort of taking them as they were and not questioning how they came to be. And I think a lot of the work that we're doing in sustainability and moving forward in general is about first just being able to question things as we have always known them, and ask questions about, is this really beneficial? Are we, is what we thought was working, is it still working, and working for whom? And who sort of set up this system, and who's benefiting from this system, and who is not, that we might be, and what might be we be missing by not questioning those things. So yeah, thanks for speaking a little bit to that, and to the importance of thinking long term, and also kind of knowing that whatever we see right now, that we are not the first ones to do this work, and there are compelling reasons for making the changes that may seem uncomfortable or challenging now. So Kimberly, I wanted to ask you a question that actually ties into one of the questions that we've gotten over Twitter, and I have been noting these, so I'm going to get to them. I haven't asked any of them yet, but most of the conversation that we've had thus far has been about looking as coffee buyers, or as coffee sort of consuming and people, at some of the instances of gender inequity and inequality, or addressing this in our supply chains, and specifically in coffee producing communities. So how do we, but that doesn't acknowledge the fact that gender inequality exists, as I stated at the beginning of this, probably at every stage. And so how do we choose where to focus our energy when we're tackling this? And then to bring in the question from Twitter, if most of what we have talked about, if most programs are focused on producers, what is the role of a cafe or a roaster or a barista? And what are the possibilities for solidarity and from learning from each other?
Yeah, certainly there are opportunities throughout the value chain, and we should all be doing our part wherever we sit along this chain, to raise awareness, to take action, and to advocate for change. I think from our view, from the Coffee Quality Institute, really the reason why we've been looking first and foremost at the producer end of the value chain is that if you really look at where the greatest inequity exists, and how this inequity impacts the coffee sector and the future of coffee, then really the greatest opportunity to make a difference and really start to transform how the value chain operates is to kind of support that change at the producer end. And this is where hundreds of millions of women and girls bear the brunt of poverty and climate change and food insecurity and domestic violence and oppression. And so I think it's for me, it's kind of where my heart goes, because I've seen circumstances, and of course we all read and we see things that are certainly compelled to want to do something. But it's not necessarily about me in my privileged position, or any of us here on this webinar kind of going and telling people what to do. I think there's this leading by taking action and leading by example. It is this question about is it the right thing for us as outsiders to be telling producers what to do? That was certainly a concern that came up from industry participants and in the research that we did, and I think that demonstrates that we're thoughtful, and we want to do the right thing, and we want to be respectful as we promote change. And there are some interesting things. How can what is our role as buyers, for example, and how can we help to motivate or incentivize or even talk about this issue within the value chain, and really help to cause a shift and challenge traditions respectfully. One of the things that I've been very excited about, and I know we've been hearing more about, are some of these participatory methodologies that can take place in producer communities, with the idea that it's not someone from outside telling people that they have to change, but it is actually through these participatory methods, looking with a gender lens about power dynamics and the challenges that women and smallholder farmer households face. But that there's really kind of an enlightened self-interest for the farmers themselves in participating and looking at doing things in a different way, that looking at including women's voices, or even the voice of youth in decision making at the household level and decision making at the producer organization level, that there's really a way to help shine the light on what's possible by working in a more gender equitable way.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good perspective to bring to this. Like you, I think the participatory aspect of it can help me to understand again how this work is being done together, and not by one group for another group or to another group, but that it's not really okay for anyone, not just consumers about producers, but for anyone to say like, well, that's their culture, so we can't really get involved in that because we don't understand it, when there are ample opportunities for us to understand it. It's kind of like saying, well, it's their forest, so they're going to deforest it and contaminate the rivers, and like that's their cultural practice, that's their economic right, we can't really do anything about that. It might not be ours to decide, but we do have a role. There are things that we know. So then I think that my next and last question that I brought to this, and again it kind of connects to a question that we got on Twitter, I'll ask to you, Christina, which is, when we are talking about the sort of work that Kimberly outlined in the last answer, who is we? Who does this work? Is this led by women? Is it led by women and men? Like, is it kind of in thinking about coffee, and I know that coffee is not your whole world, but it's mine. So is it like buyers or producer organizations or baristas, and then to tie in the question from Twitter that I see as sort of connected is, when we feel like we're making progress or achieving something in a particular producer community or organization, that may still be kind of an isolated example within a context of structural inequality. So how do we kind of continue to do this work, recognizing our limitations?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, and I'm probably going to piggyback off of what Kimberly was saying in her earlier answer. So I think everyone has a role to play, and in my mind, not everybody can play the same role, nor should they be playing the same role, and they can't all address the same issues at the same time. So when I was thinking about this question, I think it's important to find the right entry points and the right incentives for each actor in the value chain. And you can be guided by considering your creative or a roaster or a buyer or a barista, or B, kind of what is your sphere of influence with other actors in the industry. And I think here the P in Kimberly's partnership for gender equity is really important. So if we take, for a moment, though, the first piece, which is what can you do within your organization? This is about thinking or considering the terms and conditions of work that you offer employees. Are you careful to ensure hiring practices avoid discrimination? Do you create opportunities and equitable opportunities for both men and women to rise in your organizations and to nurture and grow talent? So I feel, when we're thinking about working in these chains, whether it's coffee or other chains, we do have to do, and this comes back to that personal reflection that we were talking about earlier, there is a little bit of, what is in our house and how can we make a direct impact on the people who we are serving by offering employment and creating good working conditions, because they too have lives that depend on the coffee value chain. The second consideration is about how each actor engages with other actors in the chain, and it's what is your sphere of influence. And this gets a little bit about, this gets closer to answering the structural inequality question without really answering the structural inequality question. But you can imagine that along value chains, you have contracts that define how partners are going to engage with each other. There are standards. People provide training. There is a brokering of deals between different actors. And each actor shapes how they're going to work with others, how they're going to organize themselves and then operate with other actors. So a buyer can outline quality specifications for coffee, and cooperatives will agree to those specifications and then do their best to meet them by changing agricultural practices, right? They're going to, or post-harvest practices, they're going to look for ways to meet the quality specifications. And both the buyer and the cooperative know that by improving quality, they can both win. I would argue that it's not terribly different for supporting gender equality. And in fact, supporting gender equality is part of this win, that you want to find ways within your sphere of influence and in the mechanisms that you have, and in the way you broker deals, the way you have contracts, the way you work with other actors, that you can understand how gender inequalities reduce quality or reduce the productivity of smallholder farms. And in the same way that you outline specifications for quality or other things, you can also work with partners to determine how they're going to operate. So simple examples are who gets to attend different meetings, or how information is delivered about production and post-harvest practices. I think an important part of this is also recognizing that for some smallholder households, coffee is not just something that they produce, but it affects the opportunities for all members of the household, right? So that increased income that they get from a thriving and growing coffee value chain influences the kind of food that is made available in the household. It influences who can go to school, repairs on the house, which means that it's not just one person in the household who has an incentive to make improvements on their production or of coffee or how they handle it post-harvest. It means that actually many other members in the household have a keen interest in making sure that an important part of their household income is maximized. And so you want to look for ways of aligning all those positive incentives from bottom to top to make sure that both households and cooperatives and buyers and the rest of the actors in the chain can sort of move towards a more positive way of working. And I think it piggybacks quite a bit off of what Kimberly was saying. I think the other piece too that's a little bit more about structural is about thinking about men and women working. I think when we talk about gender, we tend to just focus on women. I think it gets forgotten quite a bit that we're actually talking about both men and women. And in order to address the structural inequalities, and now I will answer that question, I think you have to create and think about the partnerships between men and women. In many countries, we talk about the disadvantages that women face, and often those are much greater than the disadvantages that men face, but we're actually seeing that in many places, boys aren't going to school as much as girls are. We've done a very good job of getting girls in school, but in Latin America, for example, there are some countries where boys are starting to lag. So we have to be thinking about the ways in which men and women are both individuals, but that they coexist and they support each other. So men may be gatekeepers, but they're also partners and they're spouses. And what we want to do is create an environment where, again, going back to the gender equality piece, that you create equal opportunities for both men and women to make those strategic life choices.
Thanks. A couple of things that you said, again, sort of tied into a question that we got on Twitter that I'd like to pose to Kimberly. So, I think that there are, in something in what you said, Christine, I heard a lot about the benefits to bringing this approach to every stage in the supply chain because of the opportunities around quality and productivity and bringing men into this as well as women, and I think that when it comes to coffee, we're thinking about talk a lot about quality, less about productivity, but in facing consumers, we use this language of quality a lot, and what we're trying to communicate is that it tastes good, but often the implicit, not necessarily stated part of that quality is that it's value, it's quality for the price, that there is sort of a value in this. And so Kimberly, we had this question: how do you communicate the value of women-grown coffee and gender equity initiatives to consumers? Not just, I think, in terms of price, but in terms of what is it that when coffee is grown, produced by women, or benefits from some gender equity initiative, what is the value there to the consumer?
It's a great question, and I think looking at it as women's coffee and or gender equity coffee, you'd have different ways of communicating about it, and I think importantly it has to link back to what is it that these initiatives are actually promoting? Is it just a brand? Is it just a name on a package that a woman grew the coffee? And how do we know actually what that means? Certainly, obviously, there's been a market opportunity presented to have a woman's brand, but I think we as the industry and consumers are a bit smarter than that. So I think with the experience of standards and certification, that there would be questions. What is it that we're actually talking about when we talk about these issues? Measurement is, standards and measurement would be really important. So what is it? What are we trying to achieve? What's the aspiration? Obviously, more gender equality and more women's empowerment is a process. It doesn't necessarily happen from one day to the next. And so we don't necessarily want to potentially kind of I certify, I don't mean a label, but I mean, do we want to just put a stamp of approval because a woman produced this coffee, or are we actually wanting to motivate something more? And so I think there are a lot of great initiatives out there to kind of put forward the issue, and I still think there's an opportunity for us as the industry and people that care about this issue to come together and to try to define and not do that again, kind of not do that as me sitting here in Washington D.C. with others here, but actually what is it that the producers are seeing, and it might vary from community to community, where you have some women producers say, definitely we need this to be a women's owned brand. great. And there are opportunities for that. They can clearly define what that means, and there could be some kind of a simple verification that exists for that. And there are other communities where the women say, and the men say, no, we work well together. We know we have opportunities to improve, and here are our goals, and here's what we're striving to, and here's what this gender, family coffee means in our view. So it's an important thing, because I think the consumers and coffee lovers are asking. They're hearing about the importance of women's empowerment and gender equity. So there's an opportunity for us to kind of figure it out and tease it out a bit. But I don't think there are. I do want to point to that. I think there are a couple of opportunities or initiatives that do exist. I think there's Cafe Feminino is one that has existed for some time that I think is having some interesting results, and there are some other efforts which I think we should try to find a way to support.
Great. So we're short on time. We've got about 10 minutes left, and so there are a few more questions from Twitter, and I feel like I could wrap a few of them up together into one big question that I'll pose to each of you at the end. But then there's one slight outlier question that I feel like I might actually be able to address, so I'm going to do that briefly first, which is a question: what is the percentage of women coffee buyers in the global marketplace? And the short answer is, I don't know. I'm not sure that anyone knows. There is a dearth of information about to answer questions like this. I recently came from an event which a really interesting presentation was made that dug through some data on male and female barista competitors in competitions, and historically those records weren't kept. It was surprisingly difficult to find that information, which just speaks to the fact that it's not being collected. So that's the short answer. But then I also, I think something when I read that question that occurred to me as I've been thinking about it is that when I said that at the beginning, that there weren't a lot of women in the position that I was in, it's true, maybe being from the United States and traveling to visit coffee producers and being a coffee buyer in that sense, in sort of the green coffee buyer sense, but there are many, many women around the world who buy coffee, especially in the role of coffee tasters, cuppers in producing communities. There are often women who are involved in the transactions of coffee buying. I think that fewer of them maybe occupy these positions that are ones of comparative power or renown that some of the coffee buyers in the United States have had in the past decade or so. But that doesn't mean that women aren't buying coffee. It just means that in many cases that work is being done as part of a producer organization, and maybe with less recognition to the role that they have or to their talents as coffee tasters or to the judgments that they make or their knowledge of the market prices and relative value of different coffees. So I think it might sound, I worry about sounding dismissive when I say there aren't a lot of female coffee buyers, because there probably actually are a lot of them, but they're not marketing themselves on websites that sell coffee as like globe-trotting, hard Scrabble coffee buyers. Not that I call myself that. So yeah, I think that there's more opportunity for research if that's a subject of interest, but also that that it maybe warrants defining what it is that a coffee buyer does, and what's that role and what's the value. So okay, the last question to wrap up a few of these. I want to ask about opportunities for collaboration beyond just the coffee supply chain to address a little bit of what you were getting at earlier, Christine, in this kind of structural inequality. So one question was about what the development sector can learn from social enterprise and vice versa. Another one was about how linked gender inequality is to other issues like climate change, poverty, and how do we sort of make connections between these things and address them not in isolation because they are so intertwined. And then finally, how can programs alleviate time poverty and the other burdens that women face as not just coffee producers, but farmers, mothers, community members. So that's a lot for just a few minutes, but I know you guys can handle it.
How do you want to divide this up?
Well, I could start by talking about the links between climate change and other issues, and maybe a little bit about the time poverty, and maybe you have more background with the social enterprise piece. I don't know. We can start and see how it goes. So yeah, so I'll jump in. Certainly that women and gender equity are very closely linked to climate change, to many of the challenges that we know producer communities are facing, and therefore we are facing overall as the industry. I think what we know first is that the impact of these other issues is typically harder on women and girls than it is on men. So women do tend to bear the brunt of any climate change or food insecurity or disasters. And so I think it's important for us to understand that and be able to design how can we link the interventions together. Because as Christina pointed out, one of the things that's been missing is this perspective of women, right? There are wise women and men and young people and perspectives that they bring to the table that are distinct, and in that diversity of opinion and or more experience and perspective, that you can actually find more creative solutions and more innovation to try to help solve some of these many challenges. And then, there's the action that needs to happen. And so how do we make sure that everyone has equal access to the training that they need to be able to respond to food insecurity and climate change, among others? And, and how can members in the communities, both men and women, also help to own and disseminate that information? And so it's really, I think, three key threads that need to be taken into account in terms of the, understanding the impact, bringing in the diversity of perspectives to come away with more creative solutions, and then giving access to everyone to work together to solve and to be taken care of in spite of these big challenges that they're facing.
Thanks. That was a good, wrap up. Christina, how about you?
Okay, so I'll add a couple thoughts on the climate change question, and then I'll start to pivot towards the other ones. I think I agree with Kimberly entirely, and I think in a very concrete way. Men and women have different strategies to adapt to climate change, and if you look in certain places, a very obvious one is that men migrate, and they migrate away from rural areas into urban areas, and they migrate internationally in search of other opportunities. And what happens is you have a feminization of rural areas, and you have to ask yourself who's going to take care of those crops, including coffee, when men start to migrate. And that's just one example of the ways in which gender dynamics connect with climate change and have significant impact on who it is that we think we're working with at different parts of the chain. You could look at water as well, in terms of distances women and girls have to go to find water for irrigation and crops. The harder it is to find water, the further away women or girls may have to walk. So there are a number of links between climate change and gender issues, and also the discussion of resilience and gender. The other piece on time, for me, this is a difficult one. Time, you have to think about it as a trade-off. Investing more time in a productive enterprise that you control the income over is not necessarily a bad thing. We do it. How many of us work, more than 40 hours a week? I don't know if that's a good example, but you have to be able to give people the opportunity to choose how they use their time. And that, for me, is critically important. So you want to monitor time use. You want to identify if it is a problem, if there is a double or triple burden that has other impacts on people's social life or health, or the health of other children. They may be pulling girls out of school if women are doing other things. I don't think the time issue is always negative, because we choose to spend time in other ways, and women may choose to invest in an income generating opportunity, even if it means some other negative consequences elsewhere, or they simply learn to manage it. And then we have to figure out whether that management strategy is positive or negative for them. So I think time is always wrapped up in a lot of other things, whether increase or decreases of time are good or bad. On the links between development and social enterprise, I mean, I think here what the development sector is trying to do has been trying to do over the last 10 years is make those links much more strongly with private sector, and making links to social enterprise where there is an embedded win-win in what the companies are trying to do makes a lot of sense, because you can foster and you can come to agreement on how we or change the way we view success, right? So success is not just simply profits are up, but we're thinking of different ways to measure success of companies, of economic growth, that include some of these other things that are important to us, gender equality, or what we falsely call work-life balance, and trying to find investment in sustainability, or protection for the environment. There are all these other things that we're trying to recognize as really important factors in our in development and in private and growth, and trying to figure out how to make those wins. So I think those links are really important, and they should continue to be fostered.
That was a great note to end on, connecting gender to all of these other things that we value, and many of which we haven't quite figured out a way to value yet, but we keep having these discussions because we know that increasingly they are important, and we keep finding these pieces of evidence, or we keep and trying to weave them all together. So thank you again, both of you, for being on this webinar, for giving us an hour of your time to answer these questions on behalf of our community. For those of you who are listening and watching, if you're interested in learning more, both of these individuals are great resources to you. The Partnership for Gender Equity that Kimberly represents does quarterly webinars also. So, you might check that out, the CQI Partnership for Gender Equity. And they also did a report on gender equity that was released last year. The SCAA likewise wrote a white paper called The Blueprint for Gender Equality. So there are, these are just a few places to begin. By no means comprehensive, but if you're looking for places to go to learn more, that's a good place to start. So once again, thank you all, and for your time and for your questions out there, and I look forward to talking again in the future.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.